title of my sermon this morning is Walk Boldly and Confidently, and it's drawn from the verse in the first letter of Peter that reads, "And baptism, which this prefigured now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ." Last week, on the front page of a major newspaper, I saw the picture of a security guard pointing an infrared thermometer at a man's forehead. Before anyone could enter the recently reopened store, the security guard had to check their temperature. Both the security guard and the man wore masks and stood several feet apart. The caption under the picture read, "Vital signs." The coronavirus has changed the meaning of dirty. In our reading this morning from 1 Peter, Peter used the word dirt in connection with baptism. He didn't, however, see dirt or impurity as the central focus of baptism. Peter's view of baptism was much different than Paul, who connected baptism to Christ's death. In the letter to the Romans, he wrote, "Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ's death were baptized into his death?" Paul went further and claimed that baptism was necessary because of the corruption and impurity caused by sin. We know that our old self was crucified with him so that the body of sin might be destroyed. Paul connected the uncleanliness of sin to the body that needed to die to be reborn and made clean through baptism. In Paul's view, the water of baptism cleansed the dirt of sin away. The central focus of Paul's baptismal theology was the removal of and elimination of sin. Peter viewed baptism differently. He wrote, "Baptism now saves you not as a removal of dirt from the body." Peter recognized the immorality of sinful acts, which he emphasized numerous times in 1 Peter. Like Paul, Peter acknowledged the immoral behavior of the pagan Gentiles and urged Christians to refrain from those actions. But Peter did not connect them to the body nor baptism. The central focus of Peter's baptismal theology had another purpose. What is the purpose of the infrared temperature check? To identify a fever? Yes. But is that the only reason? With so many people being asymptomatic, not showing an outward sign of sickness, and having no temperature, what good is it? I recognize that checking temperatures may stop one or two persons who didn't realize they were sick, but others, having no temperature, could enter a store or a restaurant and spread the disease regardless. I suspect that the thermometer has a dual purpose. It will stop those with a fever, but the device will also lower other people's fear. After being shut in for so long, many people have become fearful about being outside and interacting with others. COVID-19 is a virulent virus that we must treat with respect and caution, but fear has become virulent as well. In his letter, Peter also addressed fear. He knew that his readers lived in fear because of rising persecution. He thus wanted them to connect to hope and confidence by seeing baptism in a positive light. The waters didn't wash away the stain of sin. The rite didn't protect one from physical harm, and the act didn't create someone into a new person. It wasn't magic. For Peter, baptism was more like making a pledge. In our reading, Peter stated that baptism was an appeal to God for good conscience. Rather than being a protective armor, baptism was a means of publicly communicating a desire to learn about right and wrong. It was a means by which people beseeched God's help to live a good life. Through baptism, believers strengthen themselves to live without fear. Not that bad things couldn't or wouldn't happen, but that God would show them how to make the right decision, which gave them hope and confidence in a dangerous world. The infrared device is a way to help us recognize the danger of the world in which we live. It forces us to pause before we go out. We become mindful of our health and that of others. While it may not be useful in disease prevention, it can help lessen our fear. Baptism is much the same. It is not a cure-all nor a shield from sin. Instead, it's a sign by which we recognize our need for God in our lives and the desire to be led by God to make right decisions and live well. What are the hallmarks of living well? Peter wrote that they were essential to a good conscience. Earlier in our reading, Peter stated that Christians should explain their actions with gentleness and reverence, keeping a clear conscience. To have a clear and good conscience, Christians must maintain a reverence for God. Christians must also embody gentleness. The Greek word, which our reading translates as gentleness, can also be translated as meekness. Meekness is a fruitful hallmark of living well. Meekness is not one of those words we hold in high regard today. The meek might inherit the earth one day, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, but until then, it won't carry the day. Meekness has value, though. The 16th to 17th century monk Francis de Sales wrote about meekness in his Invitation to the Devout Life. He explained its usefulness in two ways. First was the meekness towards others. That he likened to humility, which I preached about in January. Second was meekness toward ourselves, which is relevant for us today. Meekness toward ourself and toward the self involves two aspects. De Sales writes, "We must not fret over our imperfections." I've heard people say that they are perfectionists. We might want to get things right the first time or hold ourselves to a high standard, but when we desire perfection, we miss the point. Perfectionism is static, with no room for growth, learning, or creativity. Perfectionism is wrong. God made us for growth, not just physically, but intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. When we think we've reached perfection, we stop growing. Moreover, we must not worry about our imperfections. We all have them, and besides, they add character, making us interesting. De Sales also highlights reactions to mistakes. He states, whenever we commit a fault, we must refrain from bitter, gloomy, spiteful, and emotional displeasure. Beating up ourselves over a mistake or failure is easy. Many do it. De Sales suggests it is vain to be so self-critical. Instead, he believes the correct response is to say the following: "Alas, my poor heart, here we are, fallen into the pit we were so firmly resolved to avoid. Well, we must get up again and leave it forever. We must call on God's mercy and hope that it will help us be steadier in the days to come. And let us start out again on the way to humility. Let us be of good heart, and from this day be more on guard. God will help us. We will do better. Inward meekness has the benefit of allowing for personal growth. We can see ourselves more clearly and make good choices that will enable us to live well. Our baptism was about selecting hope over fear. It was our pledge, promise, and appeal to God that we will walk boldly and confidently, trusting in His goodness always.